Welcome to our Big Book Telephone 12-Step Workshop. My name is Herb and I'm an alcoholic. Today is June 4th, Wednesday here in Los Angeles, California, and this call is being recorded. I invite you to join me in the attitude of an open mind and an open heart as we express it publicly in this prayer of setting aside. Please join me. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. We're beginning to look at the first step. I divide the first step into two major parts, the part before the dash and the part after the dash. Admitted we were powerless over alcohol. For the purposes of this call, I would substitute for the word alcohol, addiction. And if in fact you have a specific addiction, you could use that specific word. Because I do believe the first half of the first step applies to any addiction. Repetitive behavior over which I have no control, which leads to negative consequences. It's not scientific, it's my experience with addiction. Dash, that our lives had become unmanageable. And I've said it many times and will probably continue to say it, because I really do believe we need to be reminded about unmanageability. It's the best kept secret in the rooms of 12-step based on my experience. 35 years sober now, I was given the gift of sobriety February 21st, 1984. I did this work of the steps 4 years later, 1988. But then it was several years later, 1994, when a man introduced me to unmanageability. This was my third journey through the steps. I hadn't seen it before that. He introduced me to the set-aside prayer for the very first time, and then introduced me to the real nature of unmanageability, the spiritual malady, which then allowed me to have a new experience with steps 2 and 3, because I had really had a deep experience of powerlessness for the very first time, not with regard to the addiction, but with regard to the spiritual malady. And then that, of course, gave me a whole new perspective on step 10, where it says, we entered the world of the spirit. We've been placed in a position of neutrality with regard to our addiction. That had been a gift of grace to me the day I was willing to stop drinking to support my wife's recovery. I didn't ask for it. I didn't go to AA. I didn't pray. I didn't do anything. Alcohol and the inclination to drink was totally and 100% removed on February 21st, 1984. I went to AA a couple of months later and began my journey in the AA community, the 12-step culture, and finally 4 years later, after having a sponsor that I called every day and a meeting that I went to every day, 4 years later, I am not changed, but I don't know that I'm changed. And I begin this work that you've begun. This journey through the big book with a step guide, unpacking the suggestions and the precise instructions, applying it to our personal life. Well, in 1994, I did that with regard to unmanageability, saw the nature of the spiritual malady for the very first time, and then connected in step 10 to the understanding of what it means not cured. We're placed in a position of neutrality with regard to our addiction. That's what it says in step 10. That's the promise. Freedom from our addiction, first half of the first step. But it's also a promise that we're not cured, that we have a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual condition, maintaining steps 10, 11, and 12 on a daily basis, which then allows us to improve our consciousness and enlarge our compassion. They're not maintenance steps, but they do maintain our spiritual condition. And then we flourish, we grow, we improve our consciousness, and we enlarge our compassion. Words I explained initially when we were first starting, looking at the steps, working backwards from step 12, spiritual awakening, to step 11, our improvement of consciousness through a practice of meditation, and our daily spot check inventory when we're disturbed using the 10th step, keeping the channel clear. The first half of the first step has two components as I've experienced them from the big book. We're looking at that first component. What's wrong with our body? The doctor's opinion is that there's something wrong with an alcoholic's body. He didn't have science. He didn't do research. He actually didn't know, but he was a medical doctor and a psychiatrist. So he was prone to figure out a biological problem here. And his verbiage for that is that we might have an allergy, similar to what you would experience with cat hairs or hay fever or penicillin or shellfish. Most of you are familiar with that, even if you don't have it. An allergy is an abnormal reaction to a substance that's introduced into your system. It's a chemical reaction. It's a biochemical reaction. It's a physiological reaction. That's what he means by powerless, no choice. If I put a quart of blue ink into a gallon of white water, the white water will, in fact, dissipate the ink throughout, but become blue. That's just the nature of the chemical reaction. There's nothing that you can do to stop it. I was asked prior to the phone call to make comment on my own personal experience. Was this just a little bit different than the doctor's opinion? The doctor's opinion says that this reaction happens every time. He calls it a phenomenon of craving, not the use of the word as you would define it in a Webster's dictionary or some formal dictionary, where craving is defined as the inclination toward, the desire for, the anticipation of, all of the things that happen to us mentally and emotionally prior to engaging with the process or ingesting the substance. Two forms of addiction: substance addiction, process addiction. I've talked about that before. He calls it craving to describe the biological reaction that once we have taken the first drink, ingested the chemical into our body, that our body reacts to the chemical much like the ink in water. And it triggers what he calls a phenomenon of craving, meaning that the cellular structure, the body itself, demands more alcohol. No choice. It's a very powerful analogy, because it's not science at the time he was giving the opinion in 1939. It is science today concerning alcohol. The problem is a dysfunctional liver, as I understand it, that produces acetone. And when the acetone is introduced into the cellular system, the cells demand more acetone. It's a biological mandate, a biological imperative. I use those words that are not in the big book to try to emphasize this is a trigger moment. Now, the question that people ask me based on my experience is it didn't happen every time. I could have a drink and go back to work. I could have a drink and go home like I promised. I could not have a drink for a day or two or a week or two, depending on my circumstances and my attitude. What's that? I don't know. And with regard to the food addiction, I'm assuming that there's a parallel experience. That sometimes you get away with a bowl of ice cream or a slice of pie or a chocolate chip cookie. I don't mean to describe things to create a trigger for you, but I'm assuming that on this call, there are people that have a similar experience, that it doesn't happen every time. Well, that's called intermittent reinforcement in behavioral psychology, which is a much stronger way of reinforcing the denial that there is a problem. So it's no surprise to me that I didn't know that I didn't know, and I didn't see that I didn't see very visible evidence of a problem with alcohol, because in fact, a lot of times I didn't have a problem. Whereas on the other hand, my wife is a chronic alcoholic, in contrast to a periodic alcoholic, and it happened to her every time the last 5 or 10 years, certainly. She drank every day, and every time she drank until she passed out. I can't explain that. I don't know what the physical description or explanation of that is, but what I do know, and this might be helpful, is that as I look at the 20 years of my drinking from 1964 when I left the monastery and 1984 when I was asked to quit drinking to support her recovery. In those 20 years, as I looked back and did a timeline of my drinking, what did I drink, what happened when I drank, etc., I could see that about every 5 years, the periods got closer for the repetition of the compulsion. So it might have happened once a month in that first 5-year period, twice a month in the second 5-year period, 3 times a month in the third 5-year period, and it was happening once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week by the time I quit drinking. And so I was progressively approaching a chronic level. I can see that. I didn't experience it. I didn't feel it. I wasn't aware of it at the time. It was only with probably 10 years of sobriety as I looked back over my timeline, which is a wonderful mechanism. If you haven't done it and you have any doubt about the addiction that you're currently conscious of and dealing with, or perhaps some other form of addiction that you're suspicious of and you don't have any real experience with or consciousness of, but you're kind of exploring being addicted to work or exercise or meetings or helping, all of these kinds of things which are very approved and supported by our 12-step culture or society in general. It may in fact be that the addiction has spurted out in a different direction, like the whack-a-mole game. We tie a string around a balloon and it looks like the balloon gets tighter in the middle, but the air in the balloon exacerbates the size of the balloon on both sides. And the only way to have a smaller balloon is to let the air out. That's an analogy or a metaphor for our addiction. Bill says that the first 9 steps are for the deflation of the ego at depth. See, we're letting the air out. If we only stop drinking and go to meetings, we won't change. And we will take up an eating disorder, or we will take up a pornography disorder, or we will take up an exercise or a work disorder, or a fear or an anger disorder. We use our addiction, our substance, or the process as the mechanism for the release of the tension. And if we eliminate that mechanism, the tension doesn't go away. The tension comes from the spiritual malady, unmanageability. We're not cured. We have a daily reprieve. And we will find another way to reduce the tension. In my new book, I indicate that meditation is the medication. That kind of an improvement in our conscious contact with a power other than ourselves. This is why steps 10, 11, and 12 are the way of life, Bill calls it, and the tools of improving and enlarging our spiritual life, which is the antidote to the spiritual malady being self-centeredness. We haven't looked at that yet, but we will. That's the heart of the matter. That's the vocabulary that the big book uses. Unmanageability merely means that we're self-centered and extreme examples of it. When we have a relationship with power, it provides us a spiritual shield so that the obsession we're protected against. We're not vulnerable to the obsession. And if we're not vulnerable to the obsession, then the allergy is irrelevant. And Bill asks that question on page 23 at the end of the material that we'll look at today. If the problem were the allergy, the phenomenon of craving, then just stop it. We're reasonable people and we don't like to suffer. Just stop it. Well, of course, we've tried to stop it. And we do stop it, maybe for a day, a weekend, a week, a month, or longer. And then we pick up again, either the substance or the process that re-engages us in the addiction, because we were vulnerable to the obsession. We didn't have the spiritual shield. That spiritual shield that comes from a daily practice of 10, 11, and 12. Not perfect. I use the term practice. And we're always practicing because we never get it perfect. That perfect is a word that I've dropped from my vocabulary. So I don't know the answer to the question about the periodic, but my sense is that it's merely that evolution toward the chronic, and that Bill talks and the big book talks about a disease that's progressive, that it gets worse, it never gets better. And that's clearly my experience personally, and it's also my experience with other people. We're looking at that. We looked at the doctor's opinion, and he speculated that once we take the drink, then that's the trigger event that releases a biochemical. Hence, it comes under the category powerless, I really like to use the word no choice. Once I engage in the substance or the process, I have lost the power of choice. Then we looked at Bill's story, pages 1 through 8. That's only half the story. It's the first half of the story, but it's about his deterioration, the progressive nature of his experience with alcohol. In the beginning, he had a problem every once in a while. It didn't happen every time. He was able to be a social drinker. He was able to be a soldier and go to Europe. He was able to come home and become a stockbroker. But periodically, when he drank, he went on a toot. And those periods very quickly got very, very close, so that they were almost every time. I can't speak to whether they were, in fact, every time. And so I ask you to take a look at Bill's story to identify with his thinking, his feeling, his behavior, and his drinking. Not with his life, that would be silly. But to look at the things that you can compare with. And now we're looking at pages 17 to 23, which I believe is Bill's now commentary on the final part. He doesn't want to leave us in the dark too long. Chapter 2, after his own story, is there is a solution. So he's given us the doctor's opinion, which is very dark. He's showed us his story. The first half is very dark, but of course the second half brings in the hope, brings in the light, because he found an experience through the 6 steps of the Akshra group, and he got connected to power immediately and forever. And now he talks about a more expansive approach to there is a solution. On page 17, he says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous know thousands of men and women who were once just as hopeless as Bill. Well, the first edition, of course, said 100, because there were less than 100 people in New York and Akron and Cleveland that had, in fact, 6 months of recovery, 6 months of sobriety. But they changed that to reflect the current experience of Alcoholics Anonymous. Notice, he uses the term, nearly all have recovered. Again, reinforcing what he has on the title page, how thousands of men and women have recovered from a hopeless condition of body and mind. They have solved the drink problem. They have solved the addiction problem. They've been given freedom. They've been placed in a position of neutrality with regard to their addiction. That's what I believe that means, recovered. As I've mentioned, it's applicable to the first half of the first step. But as I mentioned earlier in this call, we're not cured from the second half of the first step. We have a spiritual malady. And then he gives us the image of a shipwreck. And of course, I believe in 1939, that was no secret about the Titanic. It had happened 20 years, 30 years earlier, but it was still very much in the people's consciousness when he talks about having this kind of shipwreck where some people are saved and most people die. The feeling of having shared in a common peril is one element of a powerful cement. He doesn't say it as clearly, but I'm sure that he meant to connect the first half of this statement, problem, a common peril, with the solution in the next paragraph. A common solution is the other ingredient in this cement that binds us. That's the name of the chapter, isn't it? There is a solution. Brotherly and harmonious action. Great news. The word gospel can be translated into good news. I believe that's what Bill is talking about. This is his message. This is his gospel. This is the great news, that there is a solution. On page 18, he gives us a real understanding of the illness. He says, it engulfs all whose lives touch the sufferers. It brings misunderstanding, fierce resentment, financial insecurity, disgusted friends and employers, warped lives of blameless children, sad wives and parents. Anyone can increase the list. Hopefully, hopefully each of you identifying with some aspect of that, or maybe all of it. The word sponsor is not in the big book, the word itself. But these next two paragraphs at the bottom really describe what a sponsor might look like and what the sponsor might have done and the profile of a sponsor. That second to the last paragraph is in italics, the big book's way of highlighting. I believe this is an indication as to what qualifies somebody to be a sponsor, that they've done their fourth and fifth step. They have some information about themselves. The ex-problem drinker, that's how they refer to themselves at that time. I'm an ex-problem drinker. A very healthy terminology. Who has found this solution, meaning a relationship with power, through the 6 steps of the Oxford group, who is properly armed with facts about himself. My sponsor's interpretation is that they've done a 4th and 5th step. How else would you be properly armed with facts about yourself? Can generally win the entire confidence of another in a few hours until such an understanding, that is self-knowledge, is reached, little or nothing can be accomplished. So it's the whole purpose of identification here. Here's what I was like, powerless. Here's what I did, steps. Here's what I'm like now, neutrality and a life that flourishes. And somebody who hears that, who is suffering, will go, wow, maybe that will work for me too. And then this wonderful profile at the last paragraph, that the person who is making the approach has had the same difficulty, meaning that they're an alcoholic, meaning that they're a meth addict, meaning that they're a food addict, meaning that they're a pornography addict. People ask me all the time about sponsorship. You need a sponsor in your particular fellowship if you have a particular specificity to your addiction, substance, or process. That's where you need to have sponsorship, and that's where you need to be in your fellowship. That he obviously knows what he is talking about, meaning he understands the disease, but he also understands the recovery process, and that he's experienced it, that his whole deportment shouts at the new prospect that he is a man with a real answer. Notice it's his deportment, not his words. I've heard it said that Augustine, who was a bishop of the 4th century, a Catholic bishop, of course, and he was talking about preaching the gospel and evangelization, but here are his words. Wherever you are, preach the good news. If you have to, use words. If you have to, use words. In other words, be the model of recovery. Be a demonstration. That's what Gandhi said, didn't he? Be the change that you want to effect. That he has no attitude of holier than thou, nothing whatever except the sincere desire to be helpful. That's the line that had me jettison the word service. I don't use it any longer for myself with regard to the 12th step. I use the word help. And in my meditation, the wee small voice said, Herb, use the word help because it has earth in it. It has dirt in it. It means that you will, in fact, spend time and you will spend energy and it will be inconvenient. Use the word help, not service. Too sophisticated. That there are no fees to pay, no axes to grind, no people to please, no lectures to be endured. I hope you're hearing this if you're a sponsor. No lectures we're not anybody's parent or teacher. We're merely a lantern that stands by the side of the path and shines the light of our experience on the path that we walked so that the people we're trying to help can walk the path in the light of our experience and have their own experience. I really do not wish for any of you to have Herb's experience. I do pray that each of you has the promised experience from the big book, your own personal reaction to the actions that you will take applying these suggestions to your personal life. These are the conditions we have found most effective. After such an approach, many take up their beds and walk again. A clear allusion to the Christian scripture, Jesus healing miracles, curing the sick, that the blind see, the deaf hear, and the dead are returned to life. I don't know why that strikes me right now as a very powerful mental image, but this is my experience. I was brought for the very first time into a process that created change in my life, permanent organic change in my life. And as I stay gently pressed up against this process, the change has widened and deepened, and I've been healed. I've been deeply healed. And the reason I do this work with such passion, the majority of my waking hours are spent in it, is because I know that it works this effectively with everybody, individuals and groups like yourself. If we stay the course and we're somewhat diligent and we're somewhat consistent, there will be healing. Not only the promise of the 12th step of spiritual awakening, that change, but it's totally my experience with it. As he says on page 19, though, it requires the demonstration of these principles in our homes, etc., occupations and affairs. That's why he talks about practicing the principles in all our affairs. He doesn't ever give us a list of principles, but he gives us 4 chapters at the end, 8, 9, 10, and 11, that talk about practicing this way of life in the various circumstances that we find ourselves in, a relationship, in a family, at work, and in our communities and fellowship. He says at the second to the last paragraph, we're going to publish a book setting forth this problem and give you our combined experience and knowledge to a useful program to those concerned with an addiction problem. On the bottom of page 19, he talks about real tolerance of other people's shortcomings and viewpoints and a respect for their opinions are attitudes which make us more useful to others. Again, this is the mantra of the 12-step program, to be helpful. Our very lives as ex-problem drinkers depend upon our constant thought of others and how we may help meet their needs. We have recovered from a hopeless condition of mind and body. And the purpose of this book is to answer the question, well, what do I have to do to have that? He talks about moderate drinkers and hard drinkers, but he's really talking to us, the confirmed addict, the real alcoholic. And then he says on page 21, We lose control once we start. You see, he's reinforcing the doctor's opinion there. He talks about Jekyll and Hyde, which are merely the demonstrations of what happens to us once we begin this senseless spree he talks about. And on 22, page 22, he says our behavior patterns differ. Like the comment I made at the beginning of this call on periodic versus chronic, our patterns differ. Why doesn't common sense and willpower rule the day? He says, we don't know, but we're positive that once he takes any alcohol, whatever, into his system, at the bottom of page 22, something happens, both bodily and mentally. He hasn't really talked, nor does doctor's opinion really talk about the mental part. Mostly it's emphasized on the physical part, which makes it virtually impossible for this person to stop. The experience of any alcoholic will abundantly confirm this. You see, that's the launching pad now for the exercise that's in this assignment of filling out that worksheet on the body. It's not a test. It's not an exam. There's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. There's merely your reflection. It's meant to prompt you to take a look at your personal history and your personal experience so that you can get a connection to, once you start, you lose control. Did it happen every time? Or did it happen periodically? And when you first began the addiction, what was your experience at that time? And did it change over the history of your addiction? That's where an autobiographical bullet point review of your own personal history can be quite helpful. That was the thing that broke it open for me right in the beginning. They asked me to write out in a bullet point summary my history of my relationship with alcohol. They didn't want my general autobiographic script. They wanted just focus. When did you start? Age 12. What happened? I got drunk. I passed out. I blacked out. I threw up. And then as I went through, each time I drank, it didn't happen, but then there was a pattern, and I could see that regularly, periodically. That happened to me. And that those periods got closer, which confirmed, number one, that I have a problem, and number two, that it was progressive. And that was enough for me to start my journey. It's a very powerful tool that you could use for yourself, but it's also an easy way to get a new person who's asking you for help to get some traction with regard to the beginning of the journey of recovery. Is it not a general autobiographical writing, but a bullet point listing from the very beginning of their addiction as to what happened, what did they use, what was their experience, what were the outcomes, what were the negative consequences, and then do that through each year of their life to the present moment, and then have them read it to you, or have you read it to somebody. It was in the reading out loud that the real impression was made on me at the time, 1984. And so the clear question here from Bill that takes us to the next assignment, that would be, I believe, assignment 4, is, okay, so why not just stop then? All right, if your use of drugs and alcohol or food and behavior are a problem, just stop it. You're smart, you have willpower in many areas, just stop it. Well, we've tried that and it doesn't work. And so we're going to look at why doesn't it work, and we're going to look at the problem of the mind. Thank you. Wonderful session. Please join me in the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.